and Florida and other states where we see people denying that possibility. So we have Brianna joining us. Let me tell you how we will do our time together throughout the week. We will have a short, lectionette, I'll call it, where we will ground ourselves. The framework for this week is called Dangerous Memories, because tomorrow we will see the documentary on Miss Dorothy Cotton, with the idea that if we understood how our collective people, our allies, the mutual way in which we have fought for justice, if we anchor ourselves on the fact that we have actually bent that arc towards justice significantly, and we remember that and we remember it clearly, we will not only shore ourselves up for what's in the future, but we will also get insights on how injustice has morphed itself, which will allow us to have deeper, more strategic ways in which we do the work. And so this week is anchored around the idea of dangerous memories, with us really delving into what we know, really doing an historical pass around what we know to have been true, and what are groups doing today to actually move us closer towards that arc, and how you might be able to get involved or to support that work on the ground. And so welcome, welcome, welcome. And at this point, I will turn it over to Dr. Terry Ann Scott.
Thank you. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Thank you for really a beautiful, can everyone see the full screen? We're good? Okay. Thank you for a beautiful
Terry,
introduction.
you are on mute.
Oh.
You come off mute and I will go on mute.
I think you guys have to unmute me.
No, you're good.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Dr. Terry is put on mute by the Zoom itself. So Clem, can you request that she comes off mute so that she can, is that what's happening?
It's you.
Can you guys hear me?
Terry, you go ahead. I think Charlene had issues. I'll work on it.
Can everyone hear me though? Yeah, can I get a thumbs up? Okay, I got a thumbs up. All right, everybody can hear me. That's great. Charlene, thank you so much for that incredible introduction. That was very sweet. Yes, we met not long ago, but it seems like we've known each other a long time now. So that is really lovely. Thank you all for inviting me to do this and for putting this together. We love being a partner org with you all at the Institute. So I am Dr. Terry Ann Scott, as she mentioned. I am the director of something called the Institute for Common Power, and I'm going to talk about that in just one moment. So I'm a former associate professor of history, and I have focused for the last many, many years on African-American history. As a matter of fact, I've researched African-American history very specifically in Texas for more than 25 years. My husband is from Texas. That's where we met. We lived there for a number of years. I used to teach at the University of Washington in Seattle, and then I took a position at Hood College and left that position last year as chair of the Department of History. I'm still the associate editor, one of the associate editors for the Journal of Sports History. And my most recent book that I published last year was Lynching and Leisure, Race and the Transformation of Mob Violence in Texas. I've also done a number of public history projects in Texas on African-American history. So I am so honored to be able to come here this evening and speak about the history of Juneteenth. So as you move through the arc of this week, each night you will have that education. You'll have the conversations about what you can do now. And we thought it would be really a good idea to ground you in the actual history of Juneteenth. So I'm going to talk tonight for maybe about 30 minutes or so. And I want to encourage you, as I'm going through this, to drop questions in the chat. And somebody will interrupt me and ask the question. You do not have to wait until the end. You are welcome to do so. But remember this, if you are thinking of a question to ask, I can guarantee you that 10 or 12 other people who are on the Zoom call will say, I'm so glad that person asked that question because I had the exact same question. So as I mentioned, I'm the director of the Institute for Common Power. We just launched the Institute last June, 2022. It is the educational branch of an organization, a voting justice organization called Common Power that has worked with, Charlene has worked with that organization for a number of years. They started in 2017. And it was started by somebody who was a colleague of mine who also was a professor at the University of Washington, Dr. David Domke. I came in last year. I left a tenured position. Now, if you know anything about tenure, about 3% of all tenured professors in this country are African-American women. And so when I made that choice to leave, it was with that understanding, but it is because of the gravity of the situation we find ourselves in now. The Institute educates people about the histories of marginalized people in this country, so that they can pull back a veil, see the truth, and be moved to voting justice. Because so many of our freedoms, so much of what will allow the dismantling of structural racism has to do with voting justice. And we do that work like this through lectures, through workshops, through the Truth and Purpose learning tours that Charlene and I met on, that she went on a tour that we were giving for educators, through conferences, and through so much more. And so this evening, you'll get kind of a taste of what my team and I do. And as a historian, I'm one of the ones who does, these kinds of lectures. And so I want to give you kind of a breakdown as we're talking for the next 30 minutes about Juneteenth, exactly what I'm going to look at. What did freedom mean to formerly enslaved people? What did freedom mean to white Southern society, and how did they move against that? How did formerly enslaved people begin to restructure their lives in a post-emancipation society? And I want you, because I'm going to ask you to join this conversation and think about some of the things that you would do to place yourself in that narrative. What exactly was Juneteenth, and how are the legacies of Juneteenth still with us? And I'm going to ask everybody to center themselves, because we don't have a lot of time together. Life is busy. We have kids at home. We have other commitments. But take this time, I encourage you, to focus. Take this time to learn. Take this time to be committed to this learning and then to action. Take a deep breath and be present throughout our evening tonight. And I'm going to begin on April 9th, 1865. Now, that's not Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. April 9th, considered the close of the American Civil War. And what you're seeing here is freed individuals creating a life in freedom. And so when we talk about Juneteenth, there are a lot of misconceptions. I heard a news program this morning on CBS when they said Juneteenth came 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery. It did not end slavery. And if you thought that it ended slavery, then you were taught that, as were most Americans. And we're going to dismantle that myth here this evening. So when we talk about the process of freedom, that process of freedom did not begin with the Emancipation Proclamation. But what was the Emancipation Proclamation? When it was issued on September 26, 1862, Lincoln said that it would declare forever free enslaved people in Confederate-held territories. And that would go into effect on January 1st, 1863. So what does that say to you? If you are held as an enslaved person in a Confederate-held territory, theoretically, are you going to go to those Confederate soldiers and say, by the way, the federal government said I'm free? They don't even recognize that as their federal government. And so that did not free individuals. If you were in a Confederate-held territory and there were Union soldiers who had taken over certain portions like New Orleans or other places, then you would theoretically be free. So it did not free people in the Union. I live in the state of Maryland. Maryland was a slave state. It remained a slave state until November 1864, 6 months before the war ended. That Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to a single person in Maryland because Maryland was a Union state, just like Kentucky or Tennessee or Delaware. And so the Emancipation Proclamation did not bring freedom. It did allow Black military service in the war. And so by the numbers of almost 200,000, Black men joined the military, mostly in the Army, about 20,000 in the Navy, to fight for their freedom. So when we talk about self-emancipation or emancipation, that process of freedom began with Black people, taking it upon themselves. The numbers were close to 4 million enslaved Black people on the eve of the war. Approximately 500,000 or more ran away. They ran away during the war. They up and left. And I want you to think about exactly what that entails and the risks that are accumulated if you are caught running away. They would go to Mexico or to Canada or very widely to Union-held territories and begin to be involved in what were called contraband camps. This is one in Hampton, Virginia. So they would exist on the outskirts of Union spaces and create their own communities. They may work in those Union encampments. This is one that's in Fort Monroe, Virginia, where formerly enslaved people who had run away and gone to that Union encampment were learning how to read and write by a Black woman named Mary Peake, who was a teacher in that contraband camp. So there was self-emancipation, people running away before the Emancipation Proclamation and before the amendment that would officially abolish slavery, the 13th Amendment. That comes in April of 1865, and the Confederate States were required to ratify it before they could come back to the Union. And so, as I mentioned, there were nearly 4 million people who were enslaved in this country. Approximately 90% of all Black folks lived in the South at the time. Now, you see something here called convict leasing. We don't have time to go into that tonight, but I encourage you, because I'm not going to give you an exhaustive analysis of this history, but I'm going to pull back those curtains. I encourage you to write down convict leasing, to educate yourselves more on it. There's a wonderful book by a last name Blackman called Slavery by Another Name. It is an early form of mass incarceration that when Black people, you could no longer extract their labor for free. Instead, they would be arrested on trumped up charges and leased to states for income. The state of Alabama, for instance, before the turn of the century, 73% of their total income came from leasing out Black people, Black boys as young as 12 years old, to different labor camps. So what was happening in Texas before the end of the Civil War? Because Juneteenth is something that firmly comes out of Texas. So in 1860, there are about 182,000 enslaved people in Texas. By 1865, by the end of the war, there are nearly 250,000. A number of enslavers, slaveholders, would bring enslaved people to Texas to keep them buffered from those Union soldier marches, because Black people would run to the Union soldiers. They would go and join them for their freedom. Now, people often say that in Texas, they were woefully unaware that anything had happened, that there was any freedom. That's highly unlikely. When we think about the way that geopolitics has worked in the South, where word spread among enslaved Black people, from free Black people, from other enslaved Black people, from indigenous people, those in Texas had been aware likely of the Emancipation Proclamation. They were aware that it had been issued, even though it did not do the work of abolishing slavery. It signaled to them that the American government was willing to make this war about slavery. But the news would hold little sway over their lives because of the power structure and the racial dynamics in the state. I talked about those contraband camps. I just showed you the pictures of them in places in West Virginia and other places. There may have been, by researchers' estimation, one contraband camp in the state of Texas. Where I live in Maryland, about 25 minutes from Harper's Ferry, there were multiple ones just within about a 30-mile radius of me. And so if you think about that and compare that to one contraband camp in Texas, Texas was not an easy space to escape from slavery in. I'm going to pause for a moment just to see if there are any, oh, you're putting the names of the books. I want to make sure I'm not missing any questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and ask me. So with the absence of these Union encampments in the state of Texas, with people bringing enslaved people to the state of Texas, you have about 250,000 people who, when the war ends on April 9th, 1865, remain enslaved until General Granger arrives with about 2,000 troops. Now, remaining enslaved should not signal to you a lack of pushing against the boundaries of slavery. It should not signal to you a lack of resistance. This primary source that I have here is about an enslaved woman named Lily, who had done some side jobs and saved enough money up. And in Harris County, which is where the city of Houston is located, in 1847, she purchased her own freedom. In other places in the state of Texas, Black people planned rebellions. They ran away. They went to places like Mexico to escape slavery. They resisted before Juneteenth. On June 19, 1865, when General Gordon Granger arrives in Galveston, he read something called General Order Number 3. Now, when he reads this general order, there are a couple of kind of stories of how he did this. One says that he stood perched atop a balcony in a villa and he read it. Another says that he remained on his horse. What is firmly established, regardless of where he presented that information, or perhaps he read it more than once, both on his horse and in the villa, and this is a picture of him that's courtesy of Southern Methodist University's libraries. I actually got my master's degree at Southern Methodist in Dallas before I went to Chicago for my doctorate. So I lived in Texas for a number of years. He read this order. So follow with me and I'll read it aloud. The people are informed that, in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection hereto existing between them becomes that between employer and hired help. The freedmen are advised to remain in their present homes and work for wages. Most did not. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere. And so before we continue on with that and begin to unpack what that meant and what it looked like in the state of Texas, I want you to think about these questions. And I'm going to ask you to start to drop some answers in the chat. I'm going to open that chat so I can see it. And I want you to answer the question that is highlighted there. So think about this first. What challenges would Black people face? What did freedom mean? We'll start to talk about that. What was the process of community building? How did African Americans redefine their lives in a post-emancipation era? Because I want to delve deeply before we get into looking at some actual footage or pictures of Juneteenth, before we get into how it becomes a national holiday. I want to talk about the environment that Black people in Texas were freed into. So if you think about this transition to freedom, what's your next step? What would you do? Just drop in the chat. One thing, what would you do now? Try to find any family. Well, that's brilliant. Absolutely, Ms. Brown, because what happened when you think about the domestic slave trade, and that was the forced migration, the forced sale of over 1.2 million people from about 1790s until 1860, where people are being sold from the North and the Upper South down into the South. 1.2 million people, and most people have never heard of the domestic slave trade. About half of the African-American families were separated. So when freedom comes, people begin to post ads in newspapers looking for family members from whom they were torn away. Absolutely learn how to read. Knowledge is power. We know knowledge is power because that is why people like DeSantis and others are trying to stymie the existence of knowledge and the teaching of actual history in schools, because that is how you disempower people. What else might you do? Try to build community and form connections with others. 100%. People began to build community. They settled in other areas where other Black people were. They settled, for instance, in Dallas, Texas, around what had been a cemetery of formerly enslaved people, and they grew community around that. They may vote, right? Learn how to read, find work. Some of them would leave the South and go other places. They legalized marriages. Thank you for adding some of that information. They created Black towns, some Black towns that still exist today. One of them, for instance, Mount Bayou, Mississippi, is where Mamie Till stayed for safety when she had come down to Mississippi for the trial. They sued when children were taken from them and apprenticed under Black codes. They organized boycotts when restricted from riding on streetcars. No, Ms. Rosa Parks was not the first moment of resistance. If you were taught that, that's okay. We're going to unteach what you were taught. She wasn't even the first person that month. In Birmingham, Alabama, in the 1890s, there were nearly 100 incidents of people being arrested for protesting segregation on streetcars. And so people began to resist segregation in the moments that Jim Crow emerged following Reconstruction, and organized boycotts were restricted from doing things that were simple freedom. Other people moved to Haiti and other portions of West Africa. In Oklahoma alone, they established about 50 Black towns, many of which still exist today. And Black people would vote, and they would have high levels of political participation. They would heavily represent those who would secure new laws and amendments that establish new freedom. Sometimes we say that the 15th Amendment was given to them. My colleague, Dr. Domke, likes to say, no, Black men gave us the 15th Amendment because so many northern states voted against it. There were nearly 2,000 Black elected officials during Reconstruction. And it is important to remember that they are the ones who made it possible to ratify the 15th Amendment that then firmly secures the right to vote. They had been given the right to vote in 1867 with the first Reconstruction Act, and then it is secured for today with the 15th Amendment. And Black freedom expression and community building became the hallmarks of Reconstruction. That's what Reconstruction was from 1865 to 1877. But it was also the reestablishment of white supremacy and changing notions about crime and ideas about place. When we talk about the legacies of Juneteenth, Juneteenth was an incredible moment. On June 19th, that becomes a celebration year after year in Texas for freedom. What does that freedom look like? It's important for us to recognize that, to understand the true history of this country, so that we can both understand the patterns of oppression that have occurred and appreciate the kind of resilience and resistance of an entire people to create life in the midst of these kinds of challenges. We begin to see that in Texas in the Almanac in 1865. Immediately following Juneteenth, there was an article that was posted that lamented the loss of the free labor system of African Americans. It discussed declining cotton prices. And it said that African Americans should be, quote unquote, indebted to slavery for their, quote, advancement, originally from a state of humanity, the lowest and most degraded known to mankind, to one comparatively civilized. That was the thought that they should be indebted to. Before we get into, and I want to talk for maybe about 10 more minutes about some of the modern celebrations of Juneteenth, I want us to look at a story about a Texas town following enslavement. Now, I want you to think about this, and you can drop your answers in the chat while we're going through this. What does this particular story reveal about Black life in Texas following emancipation, in the midst of following Juneteenth? This is a story about Milliken. You can see it there in that star, near Houston, Milliken, Texas, in Brazos County. And Black people, after being emancipated, after hearing that Juneteenth Special Order Number 3 read, they began to migrate there, a number of them. And so the Black population that existed there was growing because Black people went to find safety in number. And white people were migrating to the area as well. There was a military presence because under under congressional Reconstruction, the South was divided by radical Republicans in the federal government into 5 military districts. And they placed Union soldiers in each of those districts because there was so much crime against freed African Americans. So Black people were living on the outskirts of town in Milliken. George E. Brooks was a local leader. This is the man who's featured here. He was an African American, formerly enslaved, and became a head registrar. And so he was very involved in the political process. He helped to organize voting leagues. He helped get Black people elected to the state convention to create a new constitution for the state of Texas. Much of this done not only because of the volition of African Americans, because of their willingness and interest in engaging in this process and charting their own futures, but also because of the presence of the military who was armed to stop the actual death and lynching of Black people who were trying to be involved in the political process. There was an incident on June 7th, 1868. So again, what is all of this revealing about Black life in Texas collectively? And the incident was with the KKK. The KKK, we know it emerged in 1866. It was an organization initially that was in resistance to African Americans and to white Republicans at the time. Now, let's not assume that those political parties are the same as they were then. I know people like to say that, but political parties are not static. They're ever changing. As the KKK continues by the 1920s, it included an opposition to Catholics and Jewish people as well. And it's still with us today. Just last year, they made the news for putting their pamphlets all over Baltimore and Grenada, Mississippi, and other places. And so Brooks was in church service. He was presiding over church at that time. And the Klan thought it a good idea to march into town. They had been upset about these freedom expressions. They had been upset about the high level of Black political participation in Milliken, Texas at the time. And so when they came outside of the court or outside of the church, dressed in their garbs with their faces covered, armed, what did Black people led by Brooks do in the church? The Black men came outside. All of them also were armed and they began to shoot at the Klan. That's not a story you hear very often. And it was reported in the newspapers that nobody died, but what was left at the scene were different hoods and pieces of the Klan's robes as they were scared off and away from the town. And in response to that, Black men in Milliken created a militia, and they would march because of the visibility of their organization, because they were sending a message that says, don't come here and try to trounce on our freedom. Just a few weeks later, Brooks went missing. He was found murdered. They knew it was him, even though his body had been decomposing, because he was missing a finger on one of his hands. He had already been missing that, and that's how they identified him. So what is it that this story is telling us about life in Texas if we try to begin to use this as a way to think about Black life in Texas following the emancipation of African Americans there? I added some of them, and if you have others, please add. We see that there was a high level of Black political activism across the state, not just in Milliken. where before Jim Crow disenfranchising measures began to take the right to vote away from Black people, they were heavily involved in the Black political process. Black freedom expressions, whether it was the organizing of the church or the creating of this town, were frequently considered intolerable acts that required the firm reestablishment of white dominance. Black people existing day to day, Black people beginning to establish themselves in freedom was something that was met by violent resistance, not just in Milliken, but across the South. This is one of millions of stories. That this kind of sovereignty, this autonomy, while it proved competency, it also courted the ire of many white Southerners. And yet they resisted and they showed resilience. But it also said something about Black lives theoretically being dispensable in freedom. And how do we know that? This comes from my research that I did, not only when I have done public projects in Texas, but also for my book, Lynching and Leisure. This was from a report of the Special Committee on Lawlessness and Violence in Texas for the Texas Constitutional Convention in 1868. And this is what the committee found. They said, we are authorized by facts to affirm that multitudes who participated in the rebellion, meaning the war, disappointed and maddened by their defeat, are now intensely embittered against the freedmen on account of their emancipation and enfranchisement, their right to vote, on account of their devotion to the Republican Party, and against the loyal whites for their persistent adhesion to the Union. The committee woefully concluded that it is our solemn conviction that the courts, especially juries, as a rule, will not convict ex-rebels for offenses committed against Union men and freedmen. So the Freedmen's Bureau agent had arrested a white man who severely beat a Black man. Local authorities sent the assailant to trial, and the jury found him guilty and fined him 1 penny. In a similar case that ended in the release of a white man, the Freedmen's Bureau agents protested. They said, you can't do that. That's unjust. And the courts retorted that they would not send a white man to jail for an N-word. Those are 2 cases. Here are many more. These are cases that I pulled from the Reconstruction records in the archives. There are hundreds of them. Mr. Mose inhumanely beat Margaret, a free woman of color, for desiring to leave her employee. A white man whipped, then threatened to kill Ellen, a free woman of color, for attempting to leave his employ. 2 white men, Amos Faulkner and Mark Lively, hanged John Wynn, a freed man of color, to make him disclose things he knew nothing about. You're getting the point that this becomes a moment of extreme violence for African Americans because there is a shifting in a racial hierarchy, because Black no longer means enslaved. And yet, with the dawning of Juneteenth, with the arrival of freedom for African Americans, and despite this kind of abject violence that they were subjected to, they created community. They established towns and neighborhoods. They created businesses. They responded to Jim Crow by making their own institutions. My children can't go to your kindergarten, I'll just make my own. We can't go to your store, we'll open our own. We can't go to your movie theater, we'll establish our own. They engaged in a long civil rights movement. Like I said, not that moment in 1955, but many, many years before that. I remember reading newspaper ads in Dallas from the 1890s about African Americans, as I mentioned in Birmingham and Dallas too, pushing against the boundaries of segregation on streetcars. They fought in courts for equality. They engaged in politics. The building that you see here is called the Pythian Temple. It was recently restored. It was built in 1915 in Dallas, Texas. The architect was William Sidney Pittman. He was actually Booker T. Washington's son-in-law. He created the Pythian Temple, and it housed a number of local Black businesses. That was one example of the community building that existed in Texas. By 1867, the year following General Granger's announcement, Juneteenth celebrations existed all over the state. And the merriments included rodeos, fishing, baseball games, fairs, and other celebratory acts. I'm going to show you a few pictures. Here's Emancipation Day, as it was often called in Texas, in the 1880s at Houston's Emancipation Park that still exists today. Here's a band in 1900. Austin, Texas, 24th Street, a Juneteenth celebration. I love how distinguished everyone is. It reminds me of my grandfather in these images. This is an image of a parade, and the wagon is donned in flowers in Houston in circa 1900. This is Houston's 4th Ward. another Juneteenth parade in 1908. And how does Juneteenth begin to spread? It's the Great Migration of Juneteenth. When we talk about the Great Migrations and people moving from the South to either cities in the South or more prominently to the North, to the Midwest, and then by World War II to the West, sometimes we forget that not only are people picking up themselves and taking themselves, they're taking their culture with them. I grew up in Chicago. When I was 10, I moved to Arizona in 1984. So there you have my age. You can do the math. When I was in Arizona, that was the first time in 1984 that I had ever seen Juneteenth celebrations. I didn't see them in Chicago. They weren't popular when I was young, but they were in Arizona. Why? Because people from Texas, typically when they migrated to places like Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico, California, and then up the coast. And so Juneteenth first began to spread along that Southwest corridor before it became ever more popular in other places. It was a spread of migration, of culture in the Great Migration. Here are some of the images of the celebrations in California. And how does it become a federal holiday? Well, it would become a state holiday, although not always recognized and people didn't get the day off. In 1979, a bill was presented by Representative Al Edwards from Houston. That's the gentleman in the white shirt there. And he introduced House Bill 1016. And by 1980, the state officially recognized Juneteenth as a holiday. But it was not until 2021, in the midst of growing awareness of structural inequality with the pandemic, in the midst of people watching the death, the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and later finding out about Elijah McClain and Breonna Taylor, when people were looking for some way to make sense of this nation, to try to mitigate the wrongs of the past, people began to increasingly turn to Juneteenth and learn more about it. And President Biden signed legislation in June of 2021, finally recognizing Juneteenth as a federal holiday. And he says this on the day he signs it: "This is a day of profound weight and profound power, a day in which we remember the moral stain, the terrible toll that slavery took on the country and continues to take." So what are our lessons from Juneteenth? Well, we're going to spend all week. You'll be with these incredible folks from Color Lines and other partner organizations who will be talking about the lessons from Juneteenth. I take from it this perseverance. I've given you briefly a sketch of what it looked like in a post-Juneteenth Texas and some of the challenges and the violence that people faced. And nonetheless, they created community, they created autonomy, and they celebrated their emancipation. We understand the importance of knowing this history because it is this history that so many across the country are seeking to erase. History and knowledge of history is power. And in the absence of that history, you are disempowered. You have a lack of an understanding of structural racism and how we arrived at some of the issues we have today. And if you don't understand structural racism, you are prone to assume it doesn't exist and do nothing to fix it. Now, if you want to continue to learn more about history and the offerings we have, I encourage you strongly to write down this website, instituteforcommonpower.org, join our newsletter, and we keep you informed about all sorts of lectures. Most of them are free, and our learning tours and other things that we do. On that, I would love to, I'm going to stop sharing and take any questions that people have. All right, so I'm going to start at the bottom, and we have time for a few questions, Dr. Charlene?
We do have time for a few questions. I think you began answering Nancy's question about how do we continue to share this historical truth, and just a little bit on how, because I know that when you do your tours, this is a question that comes up all the time. And so not only what your answer might be to that, but even some examples of how folks have begun to utilize their knowledge towards doing work after.
Absolutely. So one of the things, well, one of the tour that Dr. Charlene was on was one that we give for K through 12 educators. We had educators from 13 states and 3 countries, including Canada and Haiti, go on this last one. We pay for everything. It's full scholarship, from their airfare to everything on the ground. And so what they are required to do with that information then is to create a lesson plan that we then make free, available for free on our website so that other educators can use it. But they do so much more. They create community and they begin to use and apply that knowledge in their local spaces. So one of the last learning tours, we had about 12 educators come from my local school district. And this summer they are on a committee where they are creating new diversity curriculum that they will institute in the entire district. So what else do we do with that knowledge? We support our educators. We make sure we vote in school board elections that sometimes can be won or lost by 5 or 1 person. Who's going to determine if they erase the history of the school board? Who's going to determine if they create, like they did, I'm lucky in my district here, a course on African-American studies? The school board. So one thing you can do with that is pay attention to the local school boards, whether you have children or not, for that next generation. You can post articles. You'd be surprised. People can be moved by an article. You can post a book that you add. You can start a book club with some of your friends and neighbors. You can tell people about this history. You can educate yourselves so that when you are talking to people, you can share nuggets, because then people become, I've seen it in my decades as an educator, they become curious and they want to learn more, and it can change how they view the world.
Thank you so much. What I want to do before we open up broadly for questions, because this question also leads into some conversation by Brianna Brown, because Brianna sits in Texas and is a part of the work that happens there and networks of organizations across the country. So opening up for a variety of ways in which folks can actually move their minds, their hands, their feet, their voices towards moving towards a more just world. So Brianna, I want to turn it to you for you to talk a little bit about your work, and then we'll open up broadly for questions again. And again, please, folks, if something comes up for you, put it in the chat or raise your hand. This is an informal community space, and so we really want people to engage as much as possible. Go ahead, Brianna.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. I sat with my pen in hand and took lots of notes because, even as a 4th generation Texan, a lot of that history was unknown to me. So I appreciate your history lesson. While you were speaking, I was plotting my own history kind of parallel, right? Whenever you would put, plot things about Black folks' political participation in Texas, about all the ways that we created community. I'm reminded of a story, my mom's side of the family is how I become a 4th generation Texan. It's her family who have roots back to East Texas. She used to tell me a story about how, she did not like her mom. She thought she didn't like her mom because her mom wouldn't allow her to go to the fair in Austin, Texas. That's where their home was. And my mom had 2 sisters, and she just thought it was just so mean of her mom to do that. And one day, it was in the summertime, they came home, and in their backyard, they had a makeshift fair. Like all of a sudden, there were animals and hay, and, folks in the neighborhood came in, and, the kids in the neighborhood and other families. Oh, there was homemade ice cream. I remember that being like really key to my mom's memory of this. Fast forward, she was explaining to me, she was like, the reason why, she couldn't go to the fair was because the Black folks weren't able to go to the fair. And her mom was protecting her from that reality of them living in Texas. And she didn't know that in the moment. And she was very, there was like Jubilee at this one time that they had the fair in their backyard. But I know through experience, through my mom and her family, about those communities that we were creating. I grew up in an extraordinarily Afrocentric household, thanks in part to my mom, thanks to my dad. My dad was from Crendon County, Arkansas, and his family were sharecroppers. And he, over the years, he was a great raconteur, told me all kinds of stories that inform who I am today. He used to tell me that he worked from can to cane, so I wouldn't have to picking cotton. He was the best cotton picker of his 13 brothers and sisters. And he made about $1 a day picking cotton in the late 1950s in Arkansas. And, I had these 2 streams of Afrocentricity from my dad and from my mom. My mom's family, that grandmother I was describing to you who made the fair in the backyard, retired as vice president of a HBCU in Austin, Texas. in Austin, Texas, called Houston Tillotson. And on that side, I used to tease my mom about, oh, y'all bougie. But I had this bougie and I had my dad, right? And they created a household where I was very clear about my identity as a Black person. It was very connected to politics, right? To a political identity, I should say. There was a parade of magazines that came to my home ever since I can remember. Ebony, Essence, Jet, Emerge. I'm still waiting for Emerge magazine. I don't know how many people remember Emerge to come back. I never forget they put Clarence Thomas on the cover in a lawn jockey outfit. And that's when my mom said that, that was their demise, right? When they put him on. So I've always just been very steeped in this idea that my Blackness is tied to a political identity. And in Texas, as quiet as it's kept, we are home to the largest Black population in the country. We overtook New York in the last census. We're home to the most registered Black voters of anywhere else in this country. We overtook our friends in Georgia. And we have the most eligible but unregistered Black folks. And so much of the work that I've been doing in particular over the last 2 years is really to make sure that Black folks are part of whatever equation to build progressive power in Texas, that Black folks are front and center. And how that started was one, there was no research on the Black electorate. Like I went to the Google machine and I was like, I need to understand, what are, how potent we are here, just with our numbers. I was thinking there would be some sort of study into the Black electorate. There wasn't any that I could find. And so in 2020, we did, I had a Black voter study commissioned to understand both broad strokes and nuances of the electorate. And have been using that information to inform our door knocking that we do 25/8. I love that introduction that Charlene gave, because we are organizers in the tradition of, civil rights predecessors, foremothers and forefathers, and we knock on lots of doors. And then also how we talk with Black folks during the election. And I very much saw that investment and research was such a critical piece of courting Black folks to be a part of the movement, right? That we deserve to be understood, right, and appreciated. So one of the other things that Dr. Scott said when talking about that political activism, and then bringing it to like the necessity of what happens, locally. Texas is a very big state. We have the most counties of anywhere in the country. And in the counties with the largest populations, right? So our population centers, and where, coincidentally, there's the densest concentration of Black folks, we are able to elect progressives, right, that fly in the face of really apartheid conditions at the state level, that we are passing policy that materially changes our lives. And, our state legislature meets every other year. We just wrapped the official session. There have been already several special sessions called. And in this last state legislature, they took away the discretion that prosecutors have to decide which cases to try and not to try, which is an example of them chasing our work. We have been part of this national movement to elect progressive DAs. So now our DAs, the essential, I say probably the most essential part of their job is to be able to use their judgment to say yes or no, and also to have policy about which cases they will charge and not charge. That has gone away. So ostensibly, the law hasn't gone into effect, but the idea now is that district attorney is going to have to try every case. So that's been taken away. In this last legislature, additionally, they also stripped away city council's ability to pass local legislation. Again, chasing wins that we've had. So, excuse me, we were part of an effort that passed paid sick leave for the first time in any cities in the South. We've been part of efforts that pass tenants' rights ordinances. So those kinds of policies that we've been able to win on the local level are now stripped away. They've also stripped away uniquely, Dr. Scott was talking about Harris County, where Houston is. We had elected a position for just for elections. So now just Harris County doesn't have this elected person anymore that is in charge of elections. Harris County, where Houston is the largest county in Texas. It has the most Black folks of any place in this state. And so when you take away a duly elected person from any seat or abolish that seat, what you're doing is diluting the power of Black folks to make decisions and have self-determination in our cities and in our counties. So as much as, my grandfather on my mom's side was also a pastor. And I sat in and went to sleep in many church pews in my day. And he would say, but the good news is, I always know, okay, wake up, Brianna, the good news is coming. There are organizations on the ground like TOP, the Texas Organizing Project, that are going to continue to do the work that's been passed down to us and continue. It's weird. As I described, we've had this alt-right chasing our wins, right? And dismantling through preemption at the state level, that we are still innovating and figuring out ways that we can impact our folks. One of the things that we're doing internally as an organization, appreciating that we're building TOP into an institution, and an institution has to be here long after this Zoom stuff is over, right? But is here for the next generation, is that we're on a mission to become a pro-Black organization. Both, and that'll be something that is crystallized both internally and externally. We've been working with understanding how anti-Black racism shows up within our organization. We've been calibrating around what our common history is. And our organization is one that is about Black and Latino solidarity, right? We believe the path to any kind of progressive power in Texas is linking the fates of Black folks and Latinos. So to talk about this evolution, and in our evolution, we see ourselves as a pro-Black organization. That means we're bringing Latinos along with us, right? And we are trying to create a container, a Black liberatory container that can free us all. So we've been doing work to get, to get rooted in a common history, understanding the prevalence of anti-Black racism, how it shows up everywhere. It is the water that we are swimming in, understanding the history. We're doing that stuff with our hearts and our minds, with members and staff. So we are a membership-based organization. So it's not just we're bringing along a staff, right? We know we got to create real systems and structures, which is the part we're on now. So now we're down, right? We understand that for TOP to exist 3.0, we got to have a Black liberatory frame. We got to be a pro-Black organization. Now, what are the systems and structures we have to create? Because good intentions have never been enough, right? You got to have systems and structures. And then, the final part of our, at least the study that we're doing, right, is to really make some commitments to changing our behaviors, right? And it's both exciting. I'll tell y'all, it's been exciting and daunting. We just this past Saturday, we had a member meeting in Dallas, talking about and figuring out how we're taking this quantum leap in our organization. And we do that work. I'm such a firm believer in organizers and organization and the one-to-one connection, that it is actually, we of course got to go to scale in Texas, because I feel like you got to insert here, everything is bigger in Texas, right? We understand that as practitioners, and we know we need to get there door by door, right? We know we need to get there mind by mind, heart by heart. And so we really are invested in that work. And I'm excited about this, continued evolution of TOP, and what it means for not only, that kind of like the here and now, like not in like a hope for deliverance, but what it means for, and I'm surprised y'all haven't heard because they've been screaming their heads off, the next generation, my kids, right? I got Margaret and Yvonne, and this work is so critical that we do in Texas for the Margaret and Yvonne's of the world. And we know that if we're able to be successful in Texas, right, linking the fates of Black folks and Latinos to transform how democracy fundamentally works, we will transform this country. And when that happens, this world will be different. And that's what I'll leave with y'all before questions.
Yeah, Brianna, thank you so much. One of the things that I want you to lift up a little bit is that you mentioned some of the things that you all have been able to do in daunting circumstances, and the research that you've done. Can you go a little further around that research? Because I remember when I saw it for the first time, and the coalition, like really talking about the coalition that's required. Well, maybe I'll just say it because I love it's Black folks, Latinos, and progressive folks that we hardly ever hear is in Texas. And so just if you can talk just a little bit about that and what you all have been able to win as you've done that, and the idea of taking on even deeper, looking at structural anti-Blackness, even as you're winning, is a huge undertaking. How did you all even get there?
Oh, wow. Let's see, how much time do y'all have? I think that part of the work we're doing now to be a pro-Black organization is really a long-standing call of action that has been made on the organization since our inception. In polite company, I think that we are from those good ashes of Acorn. And, as an organization that is about racial and economic justice for Black folks and Latinos, we have never done that kind of like internal reckoning to understand, again, it's the water that we swim in, right? Anti-Black racism is the water that we swim in. We've never as an organization spent the time to unpack it and understand, like, what is our relationship to it? How do we dismantle it internally? So I will say, we'll be 14 years old in December. So it really has been a long-standing call of action. And I think in part it has, part of that long-standing call of action includes, the partnership with me and our other co-director, Michelle Tremillo, a Latina from the West Side of San Antonio. She's on sabbatical now, miss her dearly. And certainly a call of action from our membership. To your point, it's funny, like when state legislatures wrap is when we pull a lot of receipts of like the things that we've won. And sometimes, it's a sobering reminder because, what happens at the state led is they're chasing so much of the things that we've won. So along with, electing 5 progressive district attorneys across Texas, that have gotten into office. And like, for instance, here in Dallas County, we had a DA that issued a whole slate of things that he was not going to charge for anymore, theft under $750, because mostly what he was finding was those thefts were for things like diapers and food and stuff for sustenance, right? So that they're stripping that away is like stripping away prosecutorial discretion, strips away his ability to make those calls and to make that kind of administrative policy. We've won paid sick leave, and the real kind of bitter pill, we won it, and we won it 4 years ago, and on the eve of it taking effect, it was tied up in an injunction, and that was right at the height of the pandemic. So when our sector was really being looked at as, a lot of the ideas that had been passed down around paid sick leave, access to good healthcare, universal basic income, like these kind of wild ideas, were pulled from the fringes during like the pandemic to understand like what kind of world do we need to confront, something of that scale. On the eve of paid sick becoming a reality in Dallas, for instance, 300,000 mostly Black and Latino folks would have benefited from it. There was an injunction issued, and we've been mired in a legal battle, since 2020, April 2020. We have won. We recently won across the state enhanced library cards, which are a low-key form of municipal identification. As I was mentioning, we organize Black and Latino folks, and a lot of our folks are undocumented. Whether it was going to pick up their kid at school or, and just kind of everyday interactions, there was a real threat about like, would that interaction result in being put in some pipeline for deportation? So we've won library cards in the county of Harris, in Harris County. And I say that because, our counties are the same size as battleground states. Harris County is the size of Kentucky. It's 4 million people. So 4 million people have access to go to the library and get an enhanced library card. It's also the first library card in Texas history that has a non-binary option that you can choose. And we've won them in the city of San Antonio, the 7th largest city in the country. The sheriff there has said that it's an acceptable form of identification in whatever kind of stops. And our goal is to get that to be that for law enforcement to also accept that in other jurisdictions. And we won it in the city of Dallas. Those kind of like the enhanced library cards are, it's fine. I was talking to a member the other day and they said their grandson uses it to cash checks. It's like, who knew? I didn't, that wasn't the intention of the card, but it has a real currency, right? It's proving to have a real currency in folks' lives. We have won bail reform, again, in Harris County, misdemeanor bail reform. That's 4 million people that don't have to sit in jail if they do not have means to get out. It's funny, during the 2020 uprisings, we were ready to bail out whoever was protesting, but there was no one to bail out in Harris County because no one could, you didn't get a fine for that. Or you didn't get locked up because you didn't have, you couldn't purchase or you can pay your fine. We're on the road to winning felony bail reform, hopefully in Harris County too. We've won bail reform in Dallas County. And when I say that it breaks down to lots of mini reforms, right? So do you have, is your first hearing where they set the bail, is it contested? Do you have, if you are accused, do you have representation? In a lot of our jurisdictions, they're not initial contested hearings. So a lot of times folks, especially indigent folks that don't have representation, just end up getting locked up. So, we've won a lot of things. If you kind of double click on what bail reform means, like those things, like having defense, having public defenders available for folks, at that first hearing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Let me slide in here because I want to bring Dr. Terry into the conversation. Dr. Terry, one of the things that you pointed us to was convict leasing. Mm-hmm. And so many people don't make the connection between the process of convict leasing and what it means in 2020, 2021, or 2022 to actually win bail reform, right? That the hundreds, like that long arc around the impact. So I really want you to talk a little bit about convict leasing now that folks have heard about bail reform, to put it in context.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking about that. And Ms. Brown, thank you for all the work that you're doing. It was a pleasure to hear the work that you're doing. It's inspiring to know that we can make change. I just saw today that Governor Abbott signed something to eliminate the DEI offices in public universities. And sometimes those kinds of things can make us feel like, okay, well, we can't do anything. But you just outlined a number of wins that demonstrate that when we stay the course, and that we understand the power of our vote and the power of this kind of organizing, that we can make change. So thank you for that. In terms of convict leasing, what is at the core of convict leasing? So convict leasing emerges after emancipation. And like I said, it is in the absence of having free labor from enslaved people, but the desire to continue to have this free labor. And so in the heart of it is a conflation of Blackness and criminality. And so people are being arrested in the South for things like walking too close. Now, when I say people, Black people, walking too close to railroad lines, speaking too loudly in the presence of a white woman, selling pigs after dark. These are actual things that Black people are being arrested for. Are they crimes in a conventional sense? Absolutely not. But when you want to be able to arrest people and then the states lease them out, in the state of Texas, they would lease them to the timber industry. Convict leases built the state capitol in Austin. In places like Florida, they'd lease them to turpentine companies, iron ore in Alabama, and then you make money from them. People said it was worse than slavery. Why? Because you could treat them any way you want, and if they die, you get another one. If you owned a Black person, punishments included whipping and boxing the ears and castration and horrific things, but you may have owed money on that person to the bank, and they have a value, so you don't kill them. Now, what is the tie? So Blackness and criminality are conflated. In the public mind, you see these names in the newspapers who are arrested, but not the names, the race, Negro, Negro, Negro. So people say, well, Black people must be committing all the crimes. And so we have that same concept today. It is a patrolling of racial boundaries. It is criminalizing everyday things. We see that today when people are being arrested or police called on them for picking up garbage or whatever. And it is infused with the racism that in the criminal justice system does what? It demonstrates that Black people get much longer sentences and harsher convictions for crimes than their white counterparts, that Black people serve more time in jail for nonviolent drug crimes than white people do for violent crimes, that in some districts across this country, Black people are 14 times or more likely to get the death penalty than a white person is. And so when we see these kinds of things where Black people are arrested more often, where it starts in schools, when Black children, study after study demonstrates that when they misbehave in school, the police are called on Black children, but for white children, they're sent to counseling. This starts early on because of this endemic kind of racism that exists in this country. And so you say, well, people are committing the crime, they should pay. Well, no, people are disproportionately paying for crimes that their white counterparts are not paying for. So the kinds of reforms that we can secure today go a long way in beginning to dismantle that structural racism that allows us to arrive at a space where Black people are unfairly punished in ways that their white counterparts are not.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that and appreciate your remarks, Brianna, because I think it's important for all of us to understand that the work that is happening in organizing, grassroots organizing groups today are ways in which we are attempting to dismantle these historic legacies. And so if we enter in just thinking it's just in this moment, sometimes people are like, well, what are you upset about? It's, we're doing the best we can. It's only in this moment. Well, it's been over centuries of moments of morphing, depending on the political framework that we have, the political power that we have. We get to determine or not determine how people are being treated. And so really appreciating you bringing that into mind, Brianna, because, being able to elect progressive district attorneys is not just about district attorneys. It's about the fact that they have the ability to determine what is a crime to be prosecuted. So that, if you tie that back to the Black codes, what is the power you have to determine what is a crime? So if we begin to start thinking about that and realizing that criminality is also politically determined in many ways, right? And so we then get to unpack what is happening and what we must do to actually move us towards greater equity and justice. So let me open it up to see if there are any other questions or comments or reactions or reflections, really wanting folks that are in the room to join the conversation. So any thoughts? Laura, we're glad that you came, and please come again. We'll be together all week, and we'll be doing these kinds of gatherings throughout the year. So we hope we see you there, and have a good evening, Laura. Laura is leaving everyone. Bye, Laura. Anyone else? Any comments, thoughts, questions, reflections? Just what is coming to mind for you? Dr. Terry and Brianna, they don't know us. We'll sit here and we will wait.
Remember, right, what I said in the beginning, if you have a question that you think, oh, everybody knows the answer, guarantee they don't, and they'll be happy that you asked.
Oh, Kate says it's so good to hear about the successes. Kate, have you been getting depressed about everything you've been hearing? Kate is like, yes. It is, one of the things that we say is that one of the biggest voter suppression tools is voter depression. It is a huge tool. So let's talk a little bit about how do you, Brianna, in the state of Texas, I'm turning your statement into a question, Kate. In the state of Texas, where you see all of those things coming at you and you see Abbott doing all of those things, how the heck do you get people involved? Why do they not just close their doors and pull the shutters and just say, let me just try to get through the day?
Skilled facilitator, turning that statement into a question. I'm reminded of, one of our dear members who actually recruited 10 years ago. I've been at TOP in July. It'll be 10 years. His name was Isaac Henry. We lost him due to COVID in July of 2020. But, he used to call me up and he would say, one time he called me up and he just said this prophetic thing and then dropped the mic, basically. He's like, Bree, you know why I like hanging with TOP? You know why I like doing work with TOP? And I was like, why, Isaac? Because we have a plan and we're working the plan. And I was like, and I return to that so often when the state ledge closes and looking at, whatever the aftermath is that we do have a plan, right? And that plan is to be hubbed in the cities and counties where there is the densest concentration of Black folks and Latinos. When things that materially change our lives, because it's not actually it makes perfect sense to opt out of doing something that doesn't benefit you, right? That you don't see anything change in your lives, and inspire more and more people to participate at the polls, right? So we got to do the two things. We call it at TOP fighting with people power and political power, right? We got to make sure that people are feeling a material difference in their lives, and then we're expanding the electorate, right? We are talking to people that no one's talking to and getting those folks engaged. There have been elections where, big presidential elections where no one could care less when we actually knock on their door. What they care about is their loved one who's locked up, and neither themselves or their networks have money to get them out, right? And so being able to talk about bail reform, or being able to talk about, we, partner, Charlene said this earlier, just, there's an amazing network of organizations that are figuring it out and be able to direct them to some sort of resource or some sort of service that you don't know those things. You don't understand how that actually works unless you're on the ground every day doing the work, which we are. And I will tell you, also having kids, and I got very young. My daughters are 4 and 18 months. I'm still counting months with one of them. It is so easy. Even before kids, this was my work. This is what I had devoted myself to doing. And now with children, I'm that much more driven, and it's so easy to wrap my head around the idea that I'd be damned, right? If it's a copy and paste version of what my experience has been. So they offer a lot of solace. And P.S. it's it's easy for me to see all the kids when I look at them, right? So I do it for the Margaret and Yvonnes of the world. So it's this combo of being confident in the plan, right? Thank you, Isaac Henry, that we have a plan and we're working that plan, right? To expand the electorate in Texas, Black and Latinos in particular, that are part of this multiracial, democracy that we're building, and that we're going to be winning at the local level, right? We're going to be winning things that actually change people's lives.
Thank you, Brianna. And you mentioned what gives you your solace, your grounding, your inspiration. Dr. Terry, you are in the archives. You're dealing with real people who were so brutalized. You studied lynching in particular. How do you stay grounded? How do you not, like I said, pull the windows, shutters closed?
So, well, yeah, that's a great question. And a variety of ways, from, watching Ted Lasso to looking at my children and thinking I have to continue to create a better world for them. And to something, and I know Charlene and I had shared this with you when we were on the learning tour, that my husband said to me many, many years ago when I first started teaching. I'd always wanted to be a professor since I was 15. I got my master's and my doctorate in history, and finally got a position teaching and realizing how much it was taking out of me. And he said to me, if you don't tell them, they'll never know. And that was so profound for me. And I always tell people that applies to everybody, because when we say, if we don't tell them, that's all of our job. Now that we all know the information, if we don't tell people, they'll never know, which means that they live in a form of ignorance. That, as I mentioned previously, they assume that structural racism doesn't exist, that Wells Fargo and Bank of America are not still screwing over Black and brown people and trying to get home loans and car loans, that racism doesn't exist in schools and businesses. And so anything that you fall short of, it is all entirely your fault. And when you assume that those things don't exist, you never work to change them. It also robs us of looking at those successes, looking in history and saying, look what people accomplished. One of the ways that, and this lends to this question, that I continue to keep going is I think about the people in history. I consider history my own self-help book, because I think any challenges that I face right now, anytime that I feel like, wow, this is a lot, I think about the people who got up and simply went to go try to register to vote and were beaten or arrested or killed. When I knock on doors trying to get people to register to vote, I don't have to worry about that. Now, that doesn't mean that there is nothing that we shouldn't worry about. We've gotten a lot of hate thrown at us, especially since we've been engaged in more kind of public displays with the teaching in Florida and things like that. But if people before us could face what they faced, then I realize I can face anything. I have no excuse not to continue.
Thank you both for that powerful, those powerful remarks. Brianna said, I saw you mouth it and I saw you put it in the chat. I want to give another pause to see if there are any other reflections. Susan said, reminds me of Maya Angelou saying, do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. Yes. Yes. So we all know a little bit better. And we're going to keep knowing better. One of the things that we're committed to here at Color Lines, if you read our values, is love and rigor, a deep love for humanity and rigorous study so that we can actually know better to do better. So if I might just riff on Maya and take your piece, Susan, and make that a tagline, know better to do better. That might end up being our tagline. So, so is it Tahia? I want to make sure I say your name right. I'm just reading the chat, but feel free to come off the chat.
No, you got it.
All right. Well, why don't you
Perfect.
make your remark then, please. Bring your voice into the room.
Oh, okay. So I just watched this documentary, actually on Peacock, about civil war, sorry. And like, it's called Civil War, Who Do We Think We Are? And it was talking about like the history and kind of some of the things that came to light today. But like, I think that when we don't know what has happened, we can't do anything to change it. And so I think it's important that we do learn history so we can know how to move forward. And I think we kind of live in a place where like, come with a solution, but you can't make a solution to a problem that you don't know. That's it.
Thank you. I'm gonna have to pay folks for all these taglines. You know, they're gonna show up everywhere. I just thank you so much for that. You know, I just want to leave room for one more question if something comes to mind before we wrap up with a clip that will set us up for tomorrow. And just really feel so grateful to Brianna and to Dr. Terry, both of you. Dr. Brianna, who is out there doing serious scholarship on organizing, political movement, et cetera, and Dr. Terry, who's serious scholarship on grounding us in the historical understanding of what was really happening. And I love the comment that was in the chat about the way you did this, Dr. Terry, and showed Black self-determination was so powerful, because we often get the history in ways that promote the sense that, you know, like we need caretakers, as opposed to we need, you know, arm to arm folks that are walking with us in the process of building a different world for all of us. And so it was just very stunning. So thank you both so very much for your contribution. We want to show a brief clip. Before I do that, I want to see if there are any last comments from Brianna and Terry before we show the clip and wrap up our evening together. So Brianna and Terry, any last words for folks? What's the charge you want to leave folks with?
Well, first of all, I want to say that this was incredible to be able to share a panel with you two brilliant women. So number one, that was beautiful. And the charge that I want to leave people with is the successes. We've talked a lot about the successes, right? So we focus on what we can do, and each person can do something. And all of us represent organizations that we would want all of you to get involved in, because we have things for you to do. Everybody can do something. You are not powerless.
Thank you.
Yes, and I'll just piggyback on what Dr. Scott said. You know, I'm, as an organizer, I'm a firm believer in organization, and that we need to be together and organized. So if you see something that you want to be involved in, you know, whether that is like, you know, giving some coin, or figuring out like how you're going to show up and knock on a door, or you're going to send a letter, like whatever it is, like join an organization to do that. Something I'm reminded of all the time, like in Texas, especially because, you know, we are ground zero to a lot of the right wing's kind of like laboratory, is that they are organized, right? And people are joining their organizations. And I think, and we need to do the same. I mean, that is the legacy that has been left to us about how we form our own community, about how we throw down together. So my charge really is that people find an organizational home and belong. And many, okay, let me also say, you can belong, you can get a sense of belonging to many of them, but throw down with an organization for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. And I love how you eased into that. You could have been a pastor. Time, talent, or tithe. Give your time, talent, or tithe to something, right? Thank you so much. And so, folks, tomorrow we are going to be watching together the documentary on Ms. Dorothy Cotton. Dorothy Cotton has anchored our thinking and our hearts as we thought about this entire week, because we do see ourselves in this work in the legacy of Dorothy Cotton, making sure that we do the study that will activate us into real and political. And when I say political, I'm not talking party. I'm talking like the body politic in motion for a just world. And so, so really hope that you will return with us tomorrow to see this amazing body of work. We'll be joined by the filmmakers themselves, as well as a couple of friends, the one of whom actually has committed her life to the work of Dorothy Cotton and co-founded the Dorothy Cotton Institute, Laura Branca, and another young woman. Both of them are in the film, Tafara Walla Muhammad, who is also a deep co-conspirator of mine in Movements for Justice and just a wonderful human being. And so we will watch the documentary together and then we will chat after, followed by Wednesday, where we will have a conversation with Dr. Terry's a colleague, David Domke, and for Kate, you're in Ohio, Demario Cooper, who comes out of the same organizing lineage that Brianna does and is now the co-executive director of the Center for Popular Democracy. And they will talk about incarceration as a suppression mechanism. And so what must we do to break that open? And on Thursday, we will be talking about public education and school boards. And so we will have a conversation between Dr. James Ford and remind me, Damon, remind me, I always forget her first name, but the Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door. I know the title of the book, but I always forget her name. But it's two folks that have dedicated their lives to helping. Jennifer Berkshire, thank you so much, dedicated their life to really helping people understand this arc of public education as a frontline fight for building a just democracy. And so they will be there, and we will have some folks that are a part of the movement for public education, the movement for to push back against the dismantling of honest education. So that will be on Thursday. And then on Friday, we will wrap up with a conversation by Hassan Jeffries, as well as some folks from Chicago and Working Families Party to really dig into the voter rights and what people have encountered in this fight for real participation. And we do hope that you will come back and join us throughout the week, and let everyone know that we'll be here every evening beginning at 7. And we hope we will see you when we can see you. We hope that you will look at this amazing information again, and that you will share with your friends that they should be here with you. So thank you all for coming. And we will end with this clip from the documentary. We're about 3 minutes into the clip, so we'll be about 3 minutes over. I do apologize for running my mouth that long. And yes, please, let's see the clip.
Hold on. Hold on. People who hold power do not freely give up that power. We had to take our freedom. Indeed, that's the only way to get it. If someone gives it to you, it really isn't freedom anyway. Because if someone confers your humanity or your freedom upon you, they can also take it away. We had to claim it for ourselves.
Dorothy understood that freedom was never enough, that the ultimate goal of the freedom movement was full citizenship. Because if freedom was all that you needed, we didn't need the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, or the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. Because the 13th Amendment in 1863 said y'all is free. But we said freedom for people who spent 250 years of free labor is not enough. You can't just hold us, use us, and then set us free. We have to be free with full citizenship. The 1960s, when it was dangerous to teach a Negro, to be caught teaching black people for a woman, and particularly teaching them what she was teaching, could get you raped and killed. And yet she pushed forward.
One thing we know Miss Dorothy did in the citizenship schools was educate people on the actual laws and then encourage them to think critically. And when people start to understand that they are leaders themselves and that they don't have to wait for one person to give them instruction, being a teacher for liberation's sake, for real, threatens the setup.
So how are you preparing yourself? And not just to adhere to what is popular. After Alex Haley's popular saga, Roots, I became very curious about the very concept of roots. So I looked up that word and I discovered roots to mean that which nourishes. I'm asking you, what are you absorbing? You see, I know that what you surround yourself with, the music you listen to, the relationships that you hold on to, are channels through which you absorb values. What are the major influences in your life? Spend some time thinking about that. What is your mission in life?
Thank you all, and we hope to see you tomorrow and throughout the week. Have a wonderful evening.